Okay, so this is an introduction to Chapter 3 of Mill's Utilitarianism, looking at its sanctions. Now, any normative ethical theory that gives a sense of obligation or the oughtness of moral action is going to have to look at moral psychology, what are human beings like and how are they motivated by external kind of sanctions. You know, if you disobey the law, then there are tariffs, possibly even fines or imprisonment. And then there are internal sanctions, our conscience, whatever that might be, or are the customary established conventions of morality that people kind of accept in the ether around them because everyone else is doing it. Or that sentiment, that feeling within us for harmonious relationships with our fellow human beings in society. So remember Henry Sidgwick's biggest problem in morality is how do you reconcile self-interest with the greatest good of the greatest number? We want pleasure, but why shouldn't we prefer our own self-interest and individual pleasures over the sum total, the aggregate pleasure? So there are lots of questions to consider here. How do we bridge that gap between individual self-interest and the greatest good of the greatest number, the collective interest? Another few questions that Mill is going to consider in this chapter are the debate between inductive morality, where you just observe human nature and behavior and experience, and you kind of construct your morality from that, over against the intuitionists, people who believe that we have some innate moral faculty like a conscience. They might be rooting that in God, that it's a transcendental source, that it's been given to us and instilled in us innately by God. Mill's skeptical about that. He's not saying that necessarily conflicts with utilitarianism. In fact, he's at pains to say that utilitarianism can fit perfectly well with a transcendental morality. But he wants to give an inductive, that's to say, an observation-based account of the moral sanctions, internal and external, that we feel. Where do we get our sense of moral obligation or duty? Where does morality take its grip on us and pull us forward? And he's going to say that there's a kind of natural psychology in us, a sense of human fellow feeling and sympathy. This is going back to David Hume and his sentimentalism, that we have these feelings of empathy from childhood, and they're spontaneous within us, they kind of grow within us, but they need to be cultivated. Mill is a great believer in education. In fact, Roger Crisp says that if he has a project, it is to educate the influential in society and to kind of advance the interests of the greater good. So that's his purpose in this argument. So let's just go through. Sorry, this is John Rawls, who says, Mill's chosen vocation is evident. He sees himself as an educator of influential opinion, and the future is open, and he wants to be on the progressive side of the future. So let's, without further ado, have a look at this chapter. It's here before us, and I'm just going to make reference to pages as we go through. So his task in this chapter is to find the source of obligation, the binding force behind morality. What is its ultimate sanction? And behind this is probably a concern that if you abandon God as the ultimate sanction, or the innate conscience as the ultimate sanction, everything falls apart. Or if you lose a transcendental source, i.e. Immanuel Kant's view that the summum bonum is a kind of transcendental ideal. If you lose that, then morality will kind of crumble if it's down to human feelings. These aren't enough. They don't offer enough substance to build morality from. And Mill is kind of pushing against that and saying, no, that's not the case. So how do we get standards in morality? Well, one answer to that question is that we get standards from customary morality. We just kind of go off what tradition and circumstances in our environment teaches us is the case, but that's problematic. Take marriage in Mill's day. Typically, a woman would vow in her marriage vows to obey her husband, and then legally he would inherit her property. So there was gross inequalities between individuals written into law, and the fact that women couldn't vote as well gave them a lack of representation in Parliament. So there were injustices there, and we could mention how many working class people, even men at that time, were not allowed to vote, and so there's a classism within society, and Mill presumes equality to be a good thing and to argue for it. So customary morality isn't something that's necessarily good if we want to be progressive. And he's saying that custom has often got a kind of halo thrown around it, and we shouldn't really accept this. So why are we bound to promote the general happiness, he asks? Why am I bound to promote the general happiness? How do we bridge this gap between self-interest and the greatest good of the greatest number? Well, one task that we have to undertake is education. People might have the well springs of sympathy for their fellow human beings, but we've got to cultivate this moral character through improvement in education. And we've already talked about how the 1870 Act was going to bring 2 million children out of illiteracy into primary school education. But he's saying that the principle of utility has, as he says here, or there are no reason why it might not have all of the sanctions which belong to any other system of morals. You could draw on all means of moral compunction and obligation, duty, conscience, God. None of these are contradicting utilitarianism and need feel any threat from utilitarianism, despite Mill's obvious skepticism about them. So if we take conscience, which he's going to talk about in this section here, he's going to say that in essence, conscience is a complex phenomena, but it derives from motives of sympathy and affection. So we have conscience within us, but the essence of conscience, though it's a complex phenomena, is derived from sympathy and love, and still more from fear, from our childhood, from self-esteem, and this desire for the esteem of others, and occasionally self-abasement. We don't want others to think badly of us, so we don't eat all the biscuits, we leave some for other people. And conscience is really just a collective term for a whole variety of sanctions. These are kind of levers that society can bring externally upon us, and individually we can exact upon ourselves to kind of create this sense of moral obligation. So he's saying its binding force consists in the existence of a mass of feeling which must be broken through in order to do what violates what is our standard of right. So we have accumulated within us strong feelings, and if we break with this, then we have a feeling of afterwards remorse. So you do something that you know is hurtful or harmful or selfish, and afterwards you have a sense of remorse. That's programmed into us through education, and it's also there because of our natural predisposition to be sociable. We're kind of evolved from apes, and we're sociable. We're social mammals, so that's the way we interact. So one of the questions here that is obviously eating away at Mill is this question of whether morality is subjective or objective. And so you might root that in the question of ontology or things in themselves. This is using language that Kant used, Ding an sich, ontology, the thing in itself. And he's saying that we could put morality down to something that's quite subjective, or we could say that it is objective, and he is searching for this sense of where obligation arises, and his conclusion is really to move against a transcendental theory and to go for something much more, as we've said, based upon observation and experience, induction. So there is, many will see moral obligation rooted in a transcendent fact, an objective reality, perhaps even God, and they might say that people have an expectation of reward and punishment, maybe heaven and hell, that kind of drives their conscience to believe in an objective right and wrong, and that this obligation finds its seat outside of the mind. And when they ask, need I obey my conscience, this is really what they're thinking of, because of external sanctions and this transcendental theory, something that's transcending the physical realm of law, human law, and ultimately comes from divine law. That's one answer to the question. Mill doesn't go with that. He's saying that it's not necessary to set up this kind of dilemma of saying either it's innate and implanted or it's something totally subjective. It's either innate within us, it's kind of something that's built in to our very nature, or it's implanted in us by society and upbringing and custom. And he's kind of wanting to build a broad church here and say that utilitarianism doesn't undermine any other form of ethic, even transcendental religious ethics. It can sit alongside it quite naturally, even though that's not his own position. And he says here, on the other hand, i.e. he's not going with the transcendental, as in my own belief, moral feelings are not innate, but they are acquired. But they're not for that reason any less natural. It's quite natural for human beings to build cities, i.e. to congregate together, to work cooperatively, to cultivate the ground, even though these are acquired faculties. And he's saying that although it's spontaneous, we can cultivate these, it's springing up spontaneously within us, this sense of harmony, wanting harmony with our fellow human beings and having sympathy with other people. But it's also susceptible to be cultivated. So it's something that occurs spontaneously, naturally within us, but we can draw it out in children through upbringing and education. We can teach them to be cooperative. We can teach them the value of putting themselves second, of service, of concern for the greater good rather than their own self-interest. And indeed, we can show them that this is the source of a fulfilling life. If you look after number one all the time, ultimately you'll be sad and lonely, and you won't really amount to much. Your life project will be pretty limited and scarce unless you build your happiness into some broader project. So there is a natural basis to utilitarianism. He's going to argue here that there's a natural basis of sentiment for morality in utilitarianism. So moral associations of duty, he's going to argue here, association and harmony would make us feel it congenial. We want to harmonize with others. This is a strength of utilitarian morality because it draws upon natural moral psychology. This is a powerful principle in human nature that we kind of gravitate to other human beings and that we want to harmonize, we want to work cooperatively. And so it's kind of harnessing that. And there may be a state of savage independence, but when you educate and cultivate human sympathies, then they develop in this way. It's interesting that John Skorupski, in Why Read Mill Today, he says that in Mill's autobiography, he recovered from his period of depression after 1827. He was 20 at that stage. And he did so by reading the poetry of the Prelude by the poet Wordsworth and Samuel Taylor Coleridge. But what he realized was that his feelings in his homeschool education of his father had been undercultivated. The kind of natural, spontaneous feelings of sympathy for fellow human beings and sociability had been cut off in a sense because he'd been homeschooled. He hadn't been encouraged to mix with other children of his age. He'd been kind of denied a childhood, really. And so in restoring his wider sympathies and emotions, he saw how you could cultivate autobiographically in his own experience. He saw how you could cultivate emotions of sympathy towards fellow human beings and take the powerful natural sentiments that are there and to work them to the advancement of civilization. And that's what he's going to argue here, that we can have the advancement of civilization, this society between human beings, except between masters and slaves, is going to be based upon equals. Now, this is a bit of a presumption in Mill. He presumes the principle of impartiality, that you should privilege the interests of the greatest good of the greatest number, even at times over your own. And also he presumes that each's interests are to count equally, taking Bentham's idea. Those are assumptions he makes as kind of working hypotheses. And we'll see that he grounds those in the fact that everybody pursues their own pleasure and moves away from pain, and therefore we can have enough fellow sympathy with human beings to understand that that's what they also desire. So he is arguing here for advancing civilization. They're all states of civilization, except with absolute monarchs and slaves and masters, we can treat equality as something that's important, and that we should aim for progress, not individual self-interest as our aim, at least for the time being, but cooperative interests that we should look for, and the welfare of others is something that we should look for. We have an interest in sympathy with others, and we should kind of nourish this. If you belong to a body, a kind of sense of belonging to a community, then this kind of rivets to you a stronger sense of mutual dependence upon one another, and cooperative social ties kind of grow out of that. And so that gives the power of obligation, duty, stronger force, because when you cooperate, when you bind yourself together with others in community, you realize you're going to have to play by the rules. You're going to have to think about the group's best interests rather than just your own. You can see this in microcosm. Imagine you go in a small boat across the Atlantic, or you go on a summer tall ships kind of project, and there's only 25 of you in a boat. You're going to have to work together cooperatively in order for everyone to be happy. If everyone just does their own thing, everyone will be miserable. So in a sense, civilization, as it goes on, this cooperation, this sympathy, this desire for harmony becomes more and more natural, and people kind of work at it. And we work to level inequalities of legal privilege between individuals and classes, he says, and the contagion of sympathy promotes people's welfare, and we work hard at that. So this is how we kind of build progress in this respect. Some might argue that, as he says, this doesn't give sufficient sanction for his view of moral thought, but he's saying that we shouldn't interfere unduly with human freedom and individuality, but there is a binding force to morality, and it comes from the deeply rooted social nature of human beings. So every person grows up from infancy surrounded on all sides by the profession and practice of institutions like the family and schools and so on, that bind people together and give them a sense of mutual self-interest. And this is what constitutes the binding force of utilitarian morality. Sure, there are external sanctions like the law, possibly even people's religious belief in God, heaven, hell, conscience, external things. And there's also internal sanctions like conscience that are kind of self-controlling limits on our self-interest. But these work together, and he's saying at the end that it does not present itself to their minds as a superstition of education or a law despotically imposed by the power of society, but an attribute which we wouldn't do without. The conviction is the ultimate sanction of the greatest happiness principle. So what we're rooting the obligatory nature of moral sanctions in is our feelings that are there naturally, spontaneously within us, but can be educated and brought on as time goes by. So there's a powerful binding force here when we educate these natural, spontaneous feelings of fellow sympathy, and we draw together internal sanctions like are not wanting others to disapprove of us or think badly of us, are wanting the approval of others, are wanting to get on well with others and seeking harmony. And external sanctions, they all work on our psychology, and we don't really need transcendental or superstitious explanations for why human beings behave and orientate themselves towards the aggregate good, the collective good, and don't always seek their own self-interest. Why they have an interest in taking an impartial position, because this is part of their welfare. This is what will give them a sense of happiness in life. They hope for favor from others, they fear the anger of others, and they have a natural sympathy towards them. We're social creatures, says Mill. We have a strong desire for harmony with others, and this psychology allows us to overcome self-interest and to move beyond self-concern, to take a more impartial position. And we can further this through the use of education and social pressure in institutions like the law and schools. And that's where sanctions come from. We don't need necessarily a transcendental explanation that we do it because there's a divine law. We really just grow it out of human feelings and internal feelings that have been that are naturally occurring within us and that are drawn out through parenting and through education and external constraints and pressures and encouragements to be social. So that's Mill's intention here, to educate public opinion, to give a very practical-minded, observational account of why it is that human beings feel this sense of moral obligation. For Kant, it's this moral law, the summum bonum, that's kind of pressing down on you, some transcendental source. Mill gives a far simpler explanation. It's rooted in human psychology. And if you educate the naturally occurring sympathies in human beings, you can bridge this gap between self-interest and the greater good. Whether this is provable or not is the subject of the next chapter. Bentham didn't think it was, but Mill does advance a proof, and we'll look at that next.